How are we doing today? Got quite a few students are out today for personal reasons, and I certainly respect that. I'm going to try to be the best version of me I can today so that not only the people in the class engaged, but everybody who's watching on YouTube can remain engaged. And if I fail you and let you down, I apologize. It was a rough start this morning. I normally my seminar, my graduate students in seminar, they're pretty engaged, and even on Friday mornings, but from what I gather, okay, there were some lingering effects of AYCD going on. Yeah, those initials passed around. No, I'm too old and innocent to actually know what that means, but it had something to do with, I think, alcoholic beverages. That's all I can gather. Yeah, I gave them a little bit of a hard time today, and hopefully you all remain, young and innocent for the rest of your lives and never have to worry about stuff like that. But hopefully, if that does become an issue, then the 11:30 class time is not as severe as the 10 a.m. class time, or the 9:30 a.m. class time. But regardless of what it is, we're here today. We're going to be talking about some exciting topics. So Excel, obviously, we're going to start out with today. We're going to do our second Excel assignment. Then we're going to talk about our first AI prompt. I want to clarify for AI activities, I will not always have things that I will post on Brightspace related to our activities. I probably will post some materials. I did post one slide set, which you have the option of downloading if you would like to refer to it or not. You can reference back to it. It's mostly a guide. I'm going to walk through it. This is kind of a guide from a previous activity I did in another scenario, and I thought it would just be a good way to start out our discussion of AI. This is entirely optional, up to you. There are no deliverables associated with AI. This is entirely for your benefit to help you guide your direction for your research project, which obviously for that, there are deliverables. The stuff we're doing in class, you don't have to submit anywhere. You don't have to save anything. I would encourage you to save some of it, as some of it may be information that's relevant to your projects, so you may want to save your queries. I just noticed, interestingly, on Copilot, when I signed in, that Copilot is actually saving chats now, and that's something they didn't have till recently. I would encourage you to make sure you still save your chats when you're going through Copilot, especially if you're running queries that are relevant to your projects. But if you miss something, it looks like they're actually archiving history now, which is kind of cool. It's kind of nice to have that. It's also a little bit spooky. It depends on your perspective. All right, let's go ahead and start on the easy stuff. We're going to talk about the Excel stuff. So I started off strong, and I apologize. I realize this first one is probably going to be something that is very, very straightforward and very, very not very challenging at all. But we're going to talk about rand functions and the various flavors of those. No, sorry, round functions, not rand functions. We will get to range functions as well. But so as you can see here, I've got my 6 students here with some exam scores associated with that. Generally speaking, when we talk about exam scores, it's just easier to report these in increments or in rounded terms. So whether usually I go to 2 decimal places, and so we might actually find some use for the round functions. And so I want to quickly go through this because I'm assuming that you probably know how to use the round functions already. That being said, I do think they have utility. Most of you may say, well, Dr. Barnes, I'm going to do this. I'm actually just going to use the number, and you can actually change the range of numbers right here. And you click on these numbers, and usually what happens is you click on the wrong one, then you have to click another one to adjust. And if you say that I get it right, you get it right every single time. I'm going to call you a liar, okay? Because nobody, like I know right here, I had to highlight decrease decimal. All right, if I want to make it smaller, that's how I do it, because it doesn't make intuitive sense. But rounding will actually just make a true numeric value for that, rounded to whatever point. So let's go ahead and round to the second decimal point. And this is a pretty easy operation. We're just going to use the round function. And put D2 as our operand number. And then we're going to say 2 decimal places, so 2 digits. Easy peasy, all right? And we can flash fill that, pick that up pretty easily. This is what I use most frequently for my particular purposes. You may find it more useful to round to the nearest whole number, so we can do that too. It's the same function. We're still going to refer to cell D2, but instead of 2 decimal places, we're going to go to 0 decimal places. All right. Now, just for laughs, I did this entirely just because I thought it was funny. I like things that are in Excel that don't think like they seem like they should make sense, but somehow work. let's go ahead and figure out if I wanted to round to the nearest hundreds, not hundredths, to the nearest hundred, so 0 or 100, what would that round function look like? So I'm going to give you a second to try to figure that out on your own. What would that function look like? And it seems so totally counterintuitive, and yet you probably have a clue of what we're going to be doing here in just a second. So see if you can round to the nearest hundred. Same thing, cell D2. All right, so number of digits. If I wanted to round to 2 decimal places, I did 2. If I wanted to round to no decimal places, I did 0. If I wanted to round to moving to the left 2 more, I'm going to do -2. Isn't that weird? Doesn't seem like it should work, and yet it does. It does. Yeah. Things that are contradicting sell for $100, Alex. I guess it's now it's Ken, isn't it? That's the host of Jeopardy. Yeah. So. All right. So he probably will never use this. In fact, I only did this because I just thought it was funny, but you'll probably frequently use these. Something that might come up is whether you're going to round up or round down. So instead of saying I want to round to the nearest whole number, let's say I want to round up, or round to the nearest whole number. I want to round up or round down to those. So that's just a pretty easy function. It's just going to be round up, and we're just going to go to 0 decimal places. So as you can see here, this looks a lot like what we've got in F, except it doesn't matter whether this is below 0.5 or above 0.5, it's always going to round up. The same thing for round down. Round down. All these on cell U2 start. Pretty simple and straightforward. If you already knew this, great. If you didn't know it, it's not particularly difficult to learn. Just as a reminder for the exam, if I ask you ask you the components of a particular formula, I will expect you to know those. So if I say on the exam, for example, I want you to round to the nearest whole number, you would need to know, first of all, which round function am I using? Are we using the basic round function, or are we using round up, round down? And you would need to know that that's to zero decimal place, or to 0 point decimals. So that's basically what all you'd be responsible for. I don't think that's particularly difficult, but it is useful. It has come up time and time again that you will need to actually use a round function. Let's do something that's a little bit more challenging, somewhat more interesting. So we're going to mix and match a few things here. So you'll notice that I've got my students here, and I've got a class code. And this class code is a combination of different components. And so I kind of like to split out those components. But something that I do very frequently that I want to do is I also want to merge names, because having last name and first name is great, but I would like to often have a full name. So let's go ahead and talk about how we have a full name. Now I'm going to actually confess something to you all. I have been a long time use for the old version of this function. It was just recently that I learned there's actually a shortcut function. It's only like 4 years old and I haven't been using it, okay? So the old version of the function was called concatenate, which is the word of the function we're doing. You all probably learned it differently back in 153. The shorthand version of this is concat. And they're exactly the same function in most respects. There is a little bit of a deviation there. The best practice is now use concat. So I'm going to go against my better judgment. I'm going to use the concat function with you all. Okay, so you all are ahead of me in that regard, but I'm going to actually start trying to use it. I will be honest, I don't even use that function anymore. There's even a shorter shortcut to this, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester. But you can kind of see if we type it in equals concat. There's actually the concat function and the concatenate function. And for all intents and purposes, like I said, they do the same thing. There is a small deviation in there, but it's not going to be relevant to what we're going to be doing. So what I want to do is I want to create first name, last name. So I'm going to do concat. I'm going to highlight C1. I'm going to hit comma. Then I'm going to put quotation marks, space, quotation marks, because I want my name to actually have a space in the middle, because it's not Michael Barnes. Michael Barnes. And then we're going to go to B2. So C2, comma, open quote, space, close quotes, then comma, B2. If we do that correctly, should have full names, and then we can copy that down because it's the same format for everybody. I will say I use the concatenate function, but I use the various shortcut versions of that very frequently. It used to be concatenate I will say I haven't only used concat in this setting. Like I said, there is another shortcut function, which I said I would never use newer versions of shortcut functions. And then I found this new shortcut function is even more convenient than concat or concatenate. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. The reason I'm not introducing it now is because I want to get into best practices of how to use formulas. Because as we're going to learn next week, formula usage in Excel is not necessarily intuitive to the way that we use grammar. So I want to get in the habit of using kind of leading formulas or leading functions in formulas. All right, let's go ahead and say, we talked about how to merge information. Let's talk about how we split out information. So as you see, class code, it looks like it's initials. And then it looks like that there's a track number in here, which you can kind of see what the track numbers represent down here. And then the banner ID is the last digit here. So if I want to split those out, how am I going to do so? So the first two are going to be pretty easy. So if I want to split out initials, I'm going to use the left function. So going to A1, we'll notice the initials are the first two items in there. So I'm going to go left, comma, or left, open parentheses, A2, comma, and I'm going to specify 2 digits. And I can pull out the initials. Now, presumably, banner ID is also part of that, but it's at the right. So we also got a function called the right function. Highlight that same cell. We're going to say A2, 1, because we want to pick up the last digit there. Say 1. Now, an interesting characteristic about these are very simple versions of these formulas, and we're going to learn another formula or talk about another formula here in a second. You probably already know it. The question is that if these are unequal lengths, could we actually adapt these formulas to pick up the fact that the length is changing? And the answer is it depends. Oftentimes, it depends on whether there's a similar parameter there, such as a floating delimiter. If we knew that there was a floating delimiter, like a comma or some other symbol, then we can actually write left and right functions to pick up floating delimiters. We just combine it with other functions. I will say, as we start moving forward, combinations of functions in the same formula are extremely powerful. You can do a lot more. It's basically greater than the sum of their parts when you actually combine functions. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Like I said, we're still kind of beginner level here, stuff that you already know, we're just reinforcing. Now the track number, you notice that there's 2 digits in the middle that I have to pick up, but I can't use left function, I can't use right function because there's information on either side. This is where we're going to use the mid function. The mid function is generally the most useful. It's also the most difficult to parse. In this situation, it's very, very easy. But like I said, we're trying to parse it with additional functions or additional formulas, and we want to actually have floating delimiters and floating places where things can show up. It becomes a little bit more challenging. We'll get into that. We'll actually look at some examples where we can actually use floating spacing. But let's go ahead and just use a very basic mid function. I'm going to highlight A2. We notice that the track number starts at character number 3, so we're going to specify start at 3. And then move over 2 digits or 2 characters. So mid A2, comma 3, comma 2. That 3 is basically saying start at the 3rd character and move over 2 characters. So we're going to split those out. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. So here's something I would like to do. The only reason we're going to do this next step is because it will not, what I would like to do next will not work if we don't do this next step. So what I'd like for you to do is I'd like you to highlight the information you just put in columns F and G. And we're just going to copy. Copy. Then I'm going to paste values. And when you do that, it's going to say, hey, wait a minute. Now you've got information here that looks like a number, but it's not a number. And in fact, we would like to convert that to a number. We'll see why here in just a second. Okay. So here's what you can do with this little yield sign. Say, hey, stop. Do we need to fix something? The answer is yes. Click on the down arrow as you have everything highlighted and convert everything to a number. Now, if you just do it on 1, you will notice everything else still has that yield sign and that little green arrow. But if you highlight everything, let me go back. You highlight everything at once, you can do it in one single operation. By the way, when you see that yield sign, that is probably the second most frequent situation where you see the yield sign. The situation that probably occurs more is we have inconsistent formulas used that are right next to each other. That happens a lot, particularly when you're doing financial statement analysis. They'll say, can I repeat this formula going forward? And the answer is no, I only want to use this formula one time. But keep an eye out for whenever you see those. Usually that's an interesting point of note that you either need to correct the error or ignore the error. All right. Now we're going to talk about my favorite formulas to use in Excel. This was my level up moment. Like when you're playing a video game and you're trying so hard to grind through and you're trying to get to the point where you can take on the next boss and you're trying to get the point and you finally reach level 10 or level 20. This is where I felt my Excel game was leveled up. Okay. I describe it to students as like the heavens opened up. I could see the face of God whenever I learned this next formula right here. And these are lookup formulas. Specifically speaking, I'm a big advocate for VLOOKUP. Now, you probably learned in 153, you probably learned VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, and then you learned the new version of XLOOKUP. I'm going to tell you right now, we will do XLOOKUP later in the course. I have some problems personally with XLOOKUP, mostly because I'm an Excel boomer, okay? But they're valid problems. We're going to start with VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP because I think that mastering those make understanding XLOOKUP as well as mastering index match a little bit easier. So we are going to look at index match and XLOOKUP a little bit later in the course. But for right now, let's do the simple ones, the old school ones. So here's what we're going to do. You will notice that we've got some scores in the previous tab. And I've got some information here where I can pull the scores. So let's go ahead, based on banner ID, do a lookup for scores. So I'm going to have some very specific parameters, and I want you to make notes of this because I have some very specific opinions about how to use lookup functions. So this is really important. Not that you just know how to do the lookup functions, but you know exactly what I mean whenever I say, here's the input we need at this particular point. So the first of these are really, really easy. So we're just going to do x equals VLOOKUP. Then we're going to specify what it is we're looking up, and we're going to specify we're going to look up banner ID in F2. All right, so far so good. And again, I'm going through this slow just so we don't miss a point because this gets really confusing really quickly if you're not familiar with this. The next is going to be table array. Now, my preference for lookups is that if we're looking at a VLOOKUP, I like specifying an entire column of information. The reason why is because when you copy and paste it down, you don't have to worry about floating cell references. That's one of my big problems with XLOOKUP is you have to specify a certain array, and then you have to specify an absolute cell reference to do it. Now, we're going to experience that here in just a second. There's going to be a problem with that with our next formula. But for the most part, VLOOKUPs, I try to make them pretty simple and straightforward. So we're going to actually just go over to exam 1 scores, and I want you to highlight columns A through E. This is a personal preference. This is not something you have to do anytime outside of this course, but I just want to explain why I prefer it this way. So we're saying we're going to look through columns A through E. The origin column is always going to be the first column. So remember, we're looking at we're looking at F2, which is banner ID, and it's saying, is there a matching banner ID here? And presumably the case is correct. And now it can return any of the results over here. So the next argument, which we're going to ask, comma, the next argument says column index number. This is telling what results do we want to return. If I say 2, it's going to return last name. If I say 3, it's going to return first name. If I just say 1, it will return the exact same result. In this one, I'm going to say, I want to return 5. I want to have that rounded exam score. Now, the last one I want to talk about, this one is one that I think is very important. It gets misused very frequently, okay? When we talk about VLOOKUPs and HLOOKUPs. The good news is that Microsoft corrected this problem with XLOOKUPs. We don't have this issue with XLOOKUPs. But you will notice that there's a parameter there that's a optional parameter. I'm going to tell you in this course, if we ever use VLOOKUPs or HLOOKUPs, this is not an optional parameter. Not an optional parameter. You always have to put information in here, and it's always the same information. You have to type in false. Okay? Now, the question is, why are we looking at false? So if you look up here, it says false is an exact match. Excel has an unerring tendency to try to find fuzzy matches. And in some situations, it can be very, very useful. In certain situations, you're trying to find a fuzzy match, like if you're looking for an address and looking for its approximate match, and it's a long, detailed string, this can be very helpful. In all of our scenarios that we're going to talk about here, I want to find an exact match for information. Specifically for this one, this is a primary key match. If I put in true here, it would try to find stuff that's approximately the same value. And it may default to saying, well, you know what? 1 is close enough to 2 that I can just return the value that's equal to 1. Now you're saying it would never do that. I will tell you right now, it will do that all the freaking time, okay? Excel is notorious for doing that, particularly if you're talking about strings where there's disparate and non-sequential information. So we're always going to use false in this scenario. All right. So again, just to verify, VLOOKUP telling we're looking at F2, which is in our class codes file, moved over to exam 1 scores. We highlighted the first 5 columns, okay? So we're looking at the entire column for information. When I said 5, it said I want to return the result in E. So I want to return this, and then it's going to specify that it has to provide this exact result. So if whatever I find in F2 is not listed here, it's going to come back with it didn't find it. It's not going to try to find an approximate match, which will be very helpful for us. So that's the detail that we're looking for here. In the cell that I specified in F2, it was number 1, so it should return a 67.57. And in fact, it did. Now, one of the reasons why I had you convert this to numbers, because since manner ID was listed in a number, it would not have returned that result unless we converted these over to numbers, which is why we went to that protocol. Okay. I tried to find a way to kind of shortcut that, but it's just really, really challenging to do everything that we want to do and not run that process. So that's why we did that. But again, you can copy this down. The nice thing about it is because we're in a VLOOKUP and we're still looking at column ranges, that we don't have to worry about using, we don't have to worry about changing relative cell references because there's no relative cell reference for the column. It's just A through E. Now, that spoils a little bit about what we're going to do next. Next, we're going to do track, okay? And you'll notice that my graduate students have 3 possible tracks. They've got audit, tax, or other, listed about whatever going to be listed here. So let's go ahead and let's run what we call an HLOOKUP. This is looking at horizontal information as opposed to vertical information. So HLOOKUP, and we're going to follow the same parameters as before, okay? We're going to say, I want to look at track number, so which is going to be G2 instead of F2. My source information is going to be rows 13 and 14 here. Now you'll notice there's a difference. For a VLOOKUP, I was looking across column presented information. For an HLOOKUP, I'm looking across row presented information. But the sequence still works. So I'm looking across this array. I'm going to return a row index of 2 because I want to look for this information in the first row, but I want to return the result in the second row. And then, as we said, whenever we use VLOOKUPs or HLOOKUPs, we always type in false, which may be a reason why XLOOKUPs are more beneficial, is you don't have to specify false for XLOOKUPs. Again, like I said, I'm an Excel boomer. And I got that result. Now, if you were ready for my spoiler and you figured out what was going on with the VLOOKUP, you're suspecting what's going to happen here when we copy this down. If you're not, you're in for a nasty surprise because we're going to copy this down. We'll get a whole bunch of bad results. Now, what was the reason for that? I kind of spoiled it when I talked about relative cell references. Keep in mind that we're operating vertically here, but we're operating horizontally here. So as we move horizontally, look what happens to the row references as we keep moving down. So they change because it's trying to actually use relative cell references, even if it's only in rows. So to fix that problem, we're going to have to change these to absolute row references, which is kind of a precursor to absolute cell references. Now, if you don't know how to do the shortcut, all you have to do is type in a $ before each of the rows in your original cell. If you do that shortcut, which I'm guessing all of you do, you can also just hit F4, and F4 will toggle between absolute and relative references. Since we're only doing rows, it's going to actually just go from absolute to relative. If we were doing specifically cells, it will toggle between absolute to relative to partial absolute. Okay, we'll actually look at some examples of that moving forward. But we want to set that to absolute in column or cell I2, and then we can copy that down, and we'll pick all those up. All right, so hopefully that seems like a pretty interesting reflection. Again, I do think that the technical details are the really important details, so please make sure you take note of that. It seems like such a small thing to say you have to type in the word false, but it does make a big difference, particularly in very large data sets. That's why I'm pretty insistent on stuff like that. All right, so now we're going to move on to our activity with Copilot. As I would say, start out with, please log into Microsoft Copilot using your Truman State login credentials. Similarly, if you would like to use ChatGPT, if you've got a ChatGPT login, that is fine. We're not going to be sharing any information that's going to be proprietary or personal, hopefully. So you can use whatever tool you want. If you are fortunate enough to have a ChatGPT 4.0, which I keep doing that, I keep saying $20 would be worth it, but then I just keep blowing it off. If you have a 4.0, then you may get stronger results than what we're about to do. But I will say that I think it's good to start with Copilot. We're not going to be running a whole lot of queries, but I do think that we'll be running enough that this will be worthwhile. So yeah, log into copilot.microsoft.com. I believe that the current version is actually using the cloud version of Copilot, which is not a big difference, but there are some tweaks that are going to look a little bit different than when I first created these slides. All right. So to start, let's just talk a little bit about what some of the context I'm going to be using. Last semester, I read this book. And by the way, whenever you hear me say the word read, I don't actually sit down and read anything except emails anymore. Usually what happens is I put in my earpods and I listen to a book, and I do that quite frequently, which I found is a way to not only occupy my attention, but actually get some good information in time that I'm not working. This is one of the books that I quote unquote read. It's called Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mullick. And we're going to see a quote by Ethan Mullick. He's actually a entrepreneurship professor at Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's kind of a big advocate for use of artificial intelligence in education. And we're going to be reflecting some of the things he talks about. And if you are really interested in this stuff, if you're fascinated beyond what just the parameters of the assignments are in this class, I strongly recommend this book. It does have some interesting implications and some concerns about the future. He talks about kind of all the different scenarios. He definitely talks about the doomsday scenario where it's like in the Terminator movies where AI takes over. He does not believe that that's one of those concerns, but he does have colleagues who have that concern area as well. That being said, I do think it's important to be able to learn this stuff, at least at an operational level. Do I think that my skills could be stronger in here? Yes. And I'm hoping that over the next few weeks as we work through this, that my skills will improve as well in this area. But if you feel really, really good about where you already know how to use AI, that's great. If you think that you can use some assistance in this, hopefully you'll find these activities useful. So let's go ahead and talk about what we mean by AI. And I'm going to characterize the tools that we're going to use primarily for this course are going to be large language models, or LLMs. Okay. And LLMs are effectively just sophisticated text predictors that are trained on massive amounts of data to determine appropriate responses. So has anybody ever looked at or done like on that game on your phone where you type in something at the very beginning and then you hit the middle button and you just kind of see what the results are? I mean, I know that's really for people who have extra time and you're Truman students, so you don't have a lot of free time. But yeah, that's effectively what an LLM does, but they do it on a much larger scale. And it actually explains a lot about LLMs. So just context, I typed in my iPhone, I typed in Stacy Caden is, and Stacy Caden's my boss, okay? And here's what I came up with. Stacy Caden is going through the process now, a part-time job at a company called and is working with a lot more people in the field, and not a big deal. Which makes no sense whatsoever. So that's where AI is at right now, okay? That's where AI is at right now. And by the way, I actually texted it to her and I had to clarify, yeah, I'm just exploring serious productive tests for Wednesday's presentation. Yeah, so this is a presentation we were doing, so that's what I was trying to explain. So Stacy Caden, Dr. Caden knows that I use her as object examples in my presentation, not just call her Voldemort, but also for artificial intelligence purposes. So what is an LLM doing? And they're effectively doing kind of the same thing, but they're doing it in a much larger and broader context. If you provide a few words, an LLM will generally is not going to be more effective than what your Apple phone already does. But the context is that if you provide more detail, it can actually be a much more effective predictor. Now, the way that it predicts is it actually predicts the next token, which a token is just a fancy term for a word or part of a word. In other words, it will look at the information that you input and say, based on the series of inputs, how can I generate the next output? What would be the most likely output? Now, there's some ways to think about this, okay? We can liken LLM text generation to development of a recipe from scratch. So one thing that I tend to work with is I tend to look at different recipes and try to figure out the best mix of ingredients for a recipe. One thing that I've been working on is chicken tikka masala. Has anybody had chicken tikka masala? My brother made it several years ago, and I'm just kind of like, wow, this is really, really good. So I'm trying to figure out what some things to do there. And this is kind of my recipe for that. Now, you will notice here that I've got the primary ingredients, and once you figure out the primary ingredients, it's assigning weights to those ingredients. It's just like a recipe. You wouldn't just naturally say, all right, I'm just going to get some arbitrary amount of basmati rice, butter, chicken breast, chili peppers, so on and so forth, and toss it in there. If you did that, you would have a fiasco, right? So you need to know approximately what are the right measures for ingredients, and those measures need to be derived. Now, keep in mind here that when we talk about large training amounts of data, the LLM itself has no idea what the correct weights for these are initially. It has to test millions and millions of times to figure out what the correct weights are for this. So imagine it would just be like taking equal amounts of each of these ingredients and then throwing them into a pan and making the dish and then trying to say, all right, that didn't work. Let's do it again. I'm going to change the weights. So it actually tries to determine what the quantities are through trial and error of this testing. Now, the interesting part comes in here where we start seeing that LLMs produce different results for the same input. So you can actually put the same information into an LLM, hit enter, and it will give you a result. Then you can clear its cache. You can say, can you clear the conversation history? Put the exact same input in, and it will put something roughly similar out, but it's not exactly the same. So an easy way to think about this is that randomizing to weights, okay? The tokens are assigned weights, but those weights are randomized to small degrees. So my example for this, I got my tikka masala ingredients, and you will notice over here that my default measure is 2 cups. But I've actually got a rand function that says I'm going to assign a weight of 0.95 to 105%. And then every single time that I run a query, it's going to reweight this to some amount that's going to be within that range. So it's very, very close, okay? In one dish, I actually have 6.25 tablespoons of butter. I cook it again, I get exactly 6 tablespoons of butter. So I just arbitrarily reweight on those measures, and it gives me a little bit of differentiation. So think about it that it's going to taste the same, close to the same every time, but it's going to be a little bit of different. Sometimes it may be a little bit spicier. Sometimes it might be a little bit more sweet. That's kind of the way that we think about the outputs from an LLM. And again, just a simple randomization function is every time that I run it, every time I run the randomization function, it reweights every single time. That's what LLM is effectively doing. All right. So let's talk about how we should consider LLMs. And this is really important because this is going to engage ourselves in what we need to do for our prompts that we're going to be moving forward. And I'm not sure we're going to get through both series of activities today. But if we don't, that's fine. I don't have any expectations for how fast we're going to progress through this. But I would like to kind of do the starting activity at the very bare minimum. So this is Ethan Mollick. This is a post on Twitter from a little over a year and a half ago, about a year and a half ago. So he says the thing about LLMs that make them unintuitive is that analogizing them to have in sci-fi is less useful than thinking of them as infinite copies of some guy named Steve, grad student who's great at coding and at art and is widely read, but makes up stuff when pressed. That last part is really problematic. Remember when we talked about AI a few weeks ago and I showed you that the AI query that Dr. Caden ran says, show me an image of Michael Barnes at Truman State University. And it gave a bio that was a very good description of what my bio is. That showed a very handsome African-American man in the image, okay? So AI will do its best to please you. It will do its best to provide information. Even if it does not have that information present, it will make things up. And we need to eliminate that bias. We need to eliminate that. Now, the good news is this was a year and a half ago. AI tools have improved. The LLMs have improved pretty substantially since then. We get a lot more accuracy, especially since we've actually moved to newer versions of these AI tools. But we still need to be experts in the field to understand whether something is proper or not. I think Dr. Otero, we were talking a little bit about Dr. Otero, and Dr. Caden has said this before, says that her students are allowed to use AI tools. But the moment that they quote a piece of code or a reference that doesn't exist, they get a 0 on the project. So there are some very high expectations if you're going to use AI tools that you quality check the work that you're providing. You can't just say, all right, this quote was from Barnes 2026. It's like, okay, Barnes probably did not write this in 2026 and 2026 did not exist, okay? By the way, that seems like it sounds like, well, an AI tool would never do that. AI tools have done exactly that, okay? Quoted something from a reference that was in the future, all right? Which if you guys quote Barnes in 2026, maybe I'm obligated to write a research paper that's actually going to quote you. I don't know. You just let me know if you decide to quote Barnes 2026, okay? I'll put it on my calendar for responsibilities to do. All right. So Mollick in his book, he actually has 4 rules for code intelligence, and we're going to talk about these at varying degrees throughout the semester. But I do think it's really important for us to think about these rules in context to what we're talking about. Always invite AI to the table. I think we need to think about how can we actually improve the work that we're going to be doing for AI. Now, I know that you're thinking, well, Dr. Barnes, there's an easy solution to this one. You could give us open AI tests and we could actually just finish the test on AI. And that sounds like a really, really good idea. I'm going to encourage you guys to use AI, but unfortunately, you're not getting to use AI tools for the test. That's just not something we're going to allow. Part of that has to do with the fact that I want you guys to be engaged in the classroom when we're learning and talk about that. A part of it also has to do with what I was just talking about, is that if you use AI tools, you're not gaining that expertise you have. So I'm going to insist that we're not using AI tools. So always is a bit of a misnomer. In majority of situations, we're going to invite AI to the table. You guys are welcome to use AI for pretty much anything else, but on the exam days, everybody's going to be logged out of the computer and logged into the test in front of them. Be the human in the loop. That's what I was talking about before. We do know that there are some problems with AI tools right now, and so we do need to be aware. I think next week we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about hallucinations and what the sources of hallucinations are. This is going to be where we, as our expert sources, are going to be really important and really necessary. This one today is what we're going to talk about. Is number 3: treat the AI like a person, but tell it what kind of person it is. This is extremely important in the core formation of what we're going to talk about with respect to prompt engineering. You need to set an expectation for AI, and you need to be able to know what it's capable of and what it could be capable of if you provide the right prompts for it. And the kind of a follow-up one is, assume this is the worst AI we'll ever use. These are just going to improve over time. Currently, the evolution rate is like it's doubling in the capacity over about an 8-month period, which is way, way faster than technologies in the past have had. The most recent rate was like a doubling in capacity over a 2-year period for other technologies, which is still a rapid pace of change. 8-month period is just ridiculous. Basically, it means that my content that I'm doing this semester will be outdated by next year. Will be outdated by the time I'm teaching this next year. So let's go ahead and do some activities. So this is an activity for an introductory prompt AI. I want you to enter the following instructions for Copilot. And this is you can use this verbatim. I want you to go to Copilot, or if you want to go to ChatGPT, I just want you to type this in. Tell me a good analogy for large language models. So just go ahead and type that in to whatever your tool of choice is. All right. So I'm guessing most of you probably got the same result I got. It says something about a library. I was curious if it was going to come back, if Copilot was going to come back. So you've asked me this question like 3 times. Why are you bothering me with this question again? Because I've definitely asked this question from Copilot before. So it says it's a massive library. And if you look at its description, it sounds pretty good. It sounds like a pretty good description of this. Now, the question is, first of all, let's start with the question. Do we think the LLM can improve upon this analogy? I would think so. I think that we can probably have a little bit more specific and articulate development. There are some concerns about how can the LLM actually improve? Can we just tell the LLM improve upon this? Possibly, all right. But what would be the best way if we wanted to have a better approach to this, that we want to be sure that this is the best analogy that we could generate? Could we rewrite our prompt to provide a little bit more context, a little bit more detail behind this? Answer is absolutely yes. So let's go ahead and let's move on to the next slide. So I want you to do the same activity, but I want you to put this prompt in. If you want to put it in verbatim, that's fine. But I want you to say, think this through step by step, come up with good analogies for large language models. First, list possible analogies. Second, critique the list, and add 3 more analogies. Next, create a table listing the pros and cons of each. Finally, pick the best one and explain it. All right, so I heard stop of typing, so I'm assuming most everybody got through the analogy. So one disappointing result here is most of you probably got the same thing back. It said massive library is going to be the best analogy, okay? Now, is the result what's important here? What would you say about the quality of the output from the LLM in the first prompt versus the quality of the output in the second prompt? Which one would you say is higher quality and provides more value to you during your query? Hopefully you're saying the second one. If you're not saying the second one, if you're just saying they're equal, then, where I guess I missed. But yeah, if we look at it, we can actually say the result is the same. but it does give us context for everything that we've looked at before. Now, why is that so important? Because we just changed our prompt ever so slightly. We provided some good input, some clear and concise input with respect to what we were expecting. And we told it not only what we're looking for, but we say here are some ways to critique your own output and to improve upon it. Now think about this. Is this something that you have done in your own education? Is this something that you've worked through in your own context? Like if you do a capstone course or capstone paper and you submit that to the instructor gives you feedback and then says, think about this on your own and ways you can improve it. And based on those tips, you can identify reasons for improvement. Answer is yes. But the very interesting point is that I didn't provide any feedback. I didn't say this is room for improvement. I said, critique your own work. And if I did that with students would probably not be able to identify that, not because you're not capable and not intelligent, but it's just not something you're used to doing. Usually you're going to output the best work you can do. But if it tries to critique its own work and looks at an external source of information, it is capable of validating that against what it currently has and determining what are the pros and what are the cons. Because again, it's dealing with a large source, a large array of details. So one of the very interesting takeaways from this is that not only can we use these LLM tools to derive output, but we can also use to critique and refine this output all by itself. Now, that doesn't mean that we just have to be absentee. We can't just look at, like, we can go in there and try to critique some of the work. Like we go and look at the output and say, which of these make sense? The library, a knowledgeable tour guide, or puzzle, or a recipe book, a puzzle solver. We might question, why is a puzzle solver going to be a good analogy? That doesn't seem to be appropriate for an LLM. So we still need to be conscious of what's going into the LLM as users. But for the most part, it takes a lot of work off our hands of the things that we would have to do in a normal scenario. So I think that this is a massive improvement over the way that we approach refinement of particular questions of this nature, particularly if we're thinking about humans interacting with one another and having to provide feedback. Having an LLM provide its own feedback is just something that is so profound and so unintuitive to everybody. All right, moving forward. We're going to talk very quickly about prompt engineering. And prompt engineering is the process of designing inputs or prompts to guide AI models to produce the desired outputs. So it's a way to provide context, instructions, and develop the AI to understand the intent and respond in a meaningful way. I actually had definitions for these that I derived originally, but then I went to Google and I said, what is prompt engineering? And they gave me definitions that were better than mine. So you can thank Google Gemini for this one. This is directly from Google Gemini and credited to that. So trust an AI tool to define information about what AI is capable of. So what are some things that we need to consider with prompt engineering? All right, and these are things that you should keep in mind as you develop your own prompts so you start working on your AI project. All right, very first thing is going to be tell the AI who it is, and also tell the AI who its audience is. So remember earlier when I was talking about Ethan Mollick's 4 rules for AI engagement, and I said tell the AI, or well, sorry, I'm going to misquote it if I don't. So treat the AI like a person, but tell it what kind of person it is. If you specify that you are in a an undergraduate AIS program at a prestigious Midwestern liberal arts university, you're trying to prepare a research project for a classroom as well as a professor who's reasonably knowledgeable about AI tools, is that going to be a different result than if you just say, all right, I need to know something about this topic? This is something very interesting, and I may be teaching you all a little bit more to, I don't want to say the word cheat because I don't think that cheating is the right term for this, but kind of shortcut on AI tools. So if you put it in, say you had to write a paper on a topic called the Spanish or about the Spanish Inquisition, okay? I know you weren't expecting the Spanish Inquisition, but yeah. You had to write on the Spanish Inquisition. By the way, if you know anything about Monty Python, that joke was hilarious and nobody laughed. So anyway, you had to write on the Spanish Inquisition, and you just typed into the AI tool, the LLM, and say, generate a 3-page paper on the Spanish Inquisition. It would probably come out. It would probably be very good, something that maybe like college level, maybe a little bit lower high school level, fairly well knowledgeable, but some details on there. What if you start with AI prompt and you tell, I am a professor of medieval history, or I guess it wouldn't be medieval history because it was later on, of 18th century, 17th, 19th century Spanish history. And I'm preparing a summary of the important events that led to the Spanish Inquisition. Provide a document and then critique the document. is that going to be a stronger prompt than just say, write a 3-page paper on the Spanish Inquisition? Well, from everything we've seen, the answer is yes. If you specify to the tool that we need to know what are the parameters and what are going to be the guidelines for your output, it is going to treat itself like this expert on Spanish Inquisition. It's going to look for expert content out there rather than just any randomly generated content that relates to the Spanish Inquisition, which probably would include the joke that I made that nobody laughed at. Anyway, so we want to actually specify who the AI is, who it is. It can role play very, very well. It can role play. I will tell you right now, I've definitely had multiple periods of time where I've told the AI, pretend you're a pirate, and it comes back and pretends it's a very good pirate. So that was more a guilty pleasure than something I was trying to do constructively. Tell the audience who it is, and then provide very specific instructions. The more detailed your instructions are in the prompts, the more detailed feedback and good feedback you'll get in this result. Secondly, when you get output from an AI, do not stop there. Don't just say, all right, paper done. You would say, all right, I don't understand this particular point. What do you mean about Richelieu, who was involved in it? I didn't think Richelieu was one of the important parties in the Spanish Inquisition. And it provides more context and more detail on those specific points. So not only are you going to identify or have it provide feedback or provide content for you, but you're going to have it provide its own feedback to make sure it clarifies information that you're not comfortable with or you're not familiar with. And then also consider making the AI present information in different ways. It does not just need to be a 3-page paper. You could say, provide me a timeline of the history of the Spanish Inquisition, or make a chart of the parties who were involved in the Spanish Inquisition and what their relationships are. The AI tools have evolved to the point that you can actually present information in a lot of different ways that provide meaningful content for you. And then use your previous knowledge to improve subsequent output. This should be familiar already. Remember in that prompt that I had you write the second time, it said, give me a series of outputs, critique those outputs, add more outputs, and then put the pros and cons in there. Again, it will evolve and it will be able to provide you with the information that you need to know, and then expand upon its own given information to provide you with a lot more detail than you would just by itself. All right, so real quick, I'm actually going to move on. We're not going to do this activity, but one thing I would encourage you to do is to think about this. This is an activity for helping through prompt engineering. This will be very helpful as you're working through your research project in this course about how to create a prompt. But we're not going to actually take the time out because we've only got like 2 minutes left in class. So I thought I had another slide. So since we only have 2 minutes left in class, the last thing I did is I actually told the Copilot that I need an image. So the final slide of my prompt engineering activity. I knew that some people are going to be absent today, but I still did a classroom of 25 accounting and business students, all giving me a rapturous round of applause. So that's where we're at right there. Don't look too closely at the picture. It's a little bit eerie at times. Some of the faces are not fully drawn, but this is kind of an example of a full primary prompt. I think you could definitely improve upon that if we're talking about art. But hopefully you find a little bit of interest in AI tools and what the prompts can actually be beneficial for. We're going to try to expand upon what we've learned today moving forward in the next few Fridays, but that's what we're starting out today. So have a good weekend. I will see you all on Monday for chapter 4.